thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity of giving 3 talks in 2 days, or 4 days. But since I was unsuccessful in getting anyone else to talk about the issue of Karaite thought, the study of Karaite thought, I thought that I should do so myself. It seems to me that the story of Karaite philosophy used to be easy. During the Golden Age, from the 9th to the 11th centuries, the Karaites were followers of the Mutazilite Kalam, mostly in the Basrian variety of Abdul Jabbar. Yusuf al-Basir wrote 2 major treatises, al-Muhtui and the Tamyiz, or Mansuri. They were translated into Hebrew and were the basis of a number of shorter Byzantine Karaite Mutazilite treatises. Al-Basir's student, Yeshua ben Yehuda, incorporated his Mutazilite Kalam in his commentary on Genesis, Reshit Rabbah. Then Aaron ben Elijah wrote Eitz Chaim, his Kalam answer to Maimonides' Guide. And after that, there are no more Karaite philosophical treatises or much Karaite creativity altogether. End of story. These 2 major Karaite thinkers are both legal experts, and Aaron ben Elijah was also an exegete. He's the Karaite Maimonides, as it were. It's interesting that al-Basir did not write commentaries on the Bible, perhaps because he was writing so soon, or at the same time as Yefet ben Eli, soon after, or at the same time as Yefet ben Eli, who had covered the entire Bible. Al-Basir attracted interest from the very beginning of Karaite studies. One should mention the work 19th century, P.F. Frankel, Martin Schreiner, and a good number of doctoral students in Budapest at the beginning of the 20th century who produced theses under the direction of Ignaz Goldstein-Goren, using the Budapest manuscript of al-Basir's Muhtui in the Kaufman collection. They also presented the selections from the unreadable Karaite Hebrew translation, Sefer Neimot. It's because of George Vida that we now have a pretty good picture of Yusuf al-Basir's thought. Vida, who wrote at length about a number of other Karaite figures, such as Salmon ben Yeruchim, Yaqub ben al-Kirkasani, Yefet ben Eli, used al-Basir's work and that of his students to show the impact of Kalam thought on Karaite thought. Vida wrote a large number of articles comparing Yusuf and Yusuf's circles and followers with his Mu'tazilite Muslim predecessors. These articles came out between 1968 and 1981. But unfortunately, before his death in 1981, Vida was unsuccessful in completing the project, which would be a full edition and commentary of al-Basir's al-Muhtui. Vida's student, David Blumenthal, published in 1985, the articles that Vida had written, plus some new material that Vida had not quite finished, and provided an edition of the Judeo-Arabic text. And the massive work which resulted is the most welcome contribution to Karaite Jewish thought, the study of Karaite Jewish philosophy, but it's not exactly the work that Vida himself would have produced. Also, for whatever reason, his work on al-Basir has not made a major impact on scholars of either Jewish or Muslim thought. And a number of the later articles on Basir, Vida complained that students of Mutazilite Kalam had ignored his earlier work. Students of Karaite thought have not added very much to our knowledge of Karaite Kalam in the 27 years since the Muhtui appeared. We have an important article in 1985, Ben Chagai Ben Shammai, on Karaite atomism, including al-Basir in a circle. In 1991, Paul Fenton published posthumously Vida's article on technical terms in al-Basir. In 1997, the first sample catalogs of the Center for the Study of Judeo-Arabic Culture and Literature were devoted. The first volume was devoted to al-Basir with additional material of Muhtui published by Chagai Ben Shammai. Wolfgang von Abel, who was a student of Chagai's, edited the Tamyiz with German translation, 2005. It's in the book display. Unfortunately, Vida produced no student for whom Karaism was a major interest. Some of his students, important students such as Paul Fenton, Colette Sirat, make reference and use Karaite materials, but this is not a major interest of theirs. We also have Yosef al-Gamil's editions of these 2 Hebrew works, the Neimot and the Machkimat Peti, based on one manuscript. But, as I said, the Hebrew is very difficult to read, and the editions are not very helpful. So the most important representative of classical Karaite Kalam is still not available for those who do not read Judeo-Arabic or French. The other major person I mentioned is Aaron ben Elijah, and his Eitz Chaim is better known for a number of reasons. First of all, the text is in Hebrew, and it's a Hebrew which is more Ibn Tindonian than it is Karaite, even though there's still Karaite terms and certain difficult locutions. It was published for the first time in 1841 in Leipzig. If you look at the title page, it says by Franz Sedelich with notes by Maurice Steinschneider, but apparently Steinschneider's name would have appeared as a co-author if it had not been for certain censorship laws in Germany at that time. And later references Steinschneider made to the work that he wasn't given sufficient credit for it. But in any event, we do have this wonderful edition, and interestingly enough, I own a copy of it given to me by the rabbi of Bulawayo, Zimbabwe, who had it in his personal library and saw me drooling and gave it to me. In contrast, the 1847 Firkovich edition, printed in Gozlove, with Simcha Isaac Lutzky's commentary Orach Chaim, has been almost totally ignored. In the Leipzig edition, the Steinschneider provided long excursuses on Aaron's sources, including Kalam sources and the relationship between Eitz Chaim and Maimonides' guide. Morris Charner translated the first half of Eitz Chaim into English with limited notes and analysis in a Columbia University dissertation in 1949. He also presented a rather balanced approach to Aaron's sources. But still, most readers have the impression of a Mutazi-like work of the old school, a Kalam answer to Maimonides, probably because of his attack on the philosophers in the introduction and the first chapter. In other words, once you read the introduction, the preface, you didn't have to read the rest of the book, even if you didn't agree with it. Eitz Chaim made it into Isaac Husik's History of Medieval Jewish Philosophy, but Husik was not enamored of the work. In a judgment I often quote, Husik said that the book affects us like a breath from a foreign clime, like the odor of a thing long buried. At least he summarized most of the book pretty fairly. And Leon Nimoy said the book represents a step backward rather than forward. Occasionally one sees some other references to Eitz Chaim, especially from people looking for a Karaite philosophical view who do not use Arabic texts. In other words, they want to know what Karaite philosophy says, and since Karaism never changed, you can look at Eitz Chaim. Daniel Frank translated and annotated into English an additional 12 chapters in addition to Charner's work. It was a Harvard University doctoral dissertation, and he offered a wide perspective on Aaron's sources and thought. Unfortunately, after the dissertation, Daniel Frank went backwards in time. He deals with earlier period, the Yefet Ben Alien exegesis, literature, and also later in time, his articles on Shechita controversy and theological issues in early modern Karaism. And I'm very sorry that he couldn't be with us for personal reasons. In addition to the editions of Yusuf al-Basir and Aaron ben Elijah's philosophical works, there have been a few important articles on specific topics in Karaite thought, such as Harry Wolfson's article on Binyamin and the Hawandi, and parts of more general histories of Jewish philosophy, such as Julius Gutmann and Colette Sirat. Colette Sirat also dealt with Karaite texts in her book on supernatural visions. We also have Ben Shammai's dissertation on Kirkasan and Yefet, his article on atomism, but he too has moved on to other areas of Karaite studies, exegesis, law, history, such as the community in Jerusalem, and not just Karaite thought. For instance, expect him to be here tomorrow, and he'll talk about halakhic issue, not a thought issue. When I look back at my own studies of Karaite philosophy, I started with Elijah Basyachi, who died in 1490, the author of Aderet Eliyahu, the Shulchan Aruch of Karaite Judaism. I went over the 10 principles of Judaism as he enunciated them in Aderet Eliyahu. And suddenly I saw that there was more Maimonides in them than Kalam. Specifically, his discussion of the afterlife, I decided that he hinted at a denial of resurrection. that resurrection was a useful belief but not necessarily true. Osiachi's language was also much more Aristotelian than Kalam. Then I looked more closely at Aaron ben Elijah and came to the conclusion that he was not an atomist. His defense of Kalam was a defense of the intellectual integrity of his Karaite predecessors against Maimonides, who had basically said that Mutakalimum are intellectually dishonest. They shoot the arrow and then put the target around it, or they decided what conclusion they wanted and then formed their physical theories of the world to promote that conclusion. So Aaron ben Elijah, the younger, was defending their intellectual integrity, the fact that atomism could be true, given the facts of the world, not necessarily that it was true. In fact, after the defense of the possibility of atomism in chapter 4, all other references in Eitz Chaim, also in his commentary to the Torah, Ketchet Torah, and his legal work on Eden, all the references to the structure of the world are to matter and form and not to atoms. I then looked at Judah Hadassi, his Eshkol HaKofer. There are Kalam elements there, but he's not a typical Mutakalim. He's a transitional figure, such as in his atomic theory, which already Chagai ben Shammai demonstrated the non-Kalamic nature of his atomic theory. It's interesting that Hadassi is contemporary with Judah Halevi, but in a totally different world. There are no other sides of the Mediterranean, but reading Halevi and then other Iberian, Andalusian writers who were contemporary with Hadassi. Hadassi was writing 1148, 1149. You would barely see any resemblance between them. But Hadassi does reflect classical Karaite thought in the school of Al-Basir and the translations. And finally, I'd say my last step in affirming the changes in Karaite thought was looking at Aaron ben Joseph, the elder, who was certainly much closer to Maimonides than to Kalam. In fact, Aaron ben Elijah, the younger, 2 generations later, was a reaction to Aaron the elder, but he doesn't totally overthrow him. I'd say parenthetically that this give and take in both theology and exegesis is ignored by those who think that charism never changed over the years. So you had Aaron ben Joseph, the, I don't know what term, moderate, the intellectual Aristotelian rationalist, and Aaron ben Elijah, who does his best to bring charism back to a more conservative stance, but certainly not as far as going back to the older philosophical and legal traditions. It's interesting that Aaron the Elder himself explains that he doesn't say one of the reasons I became a Maimonidean, but one can understand it, is the fact that he couldn't read the Karaite Hebrew works. What he could read was Ibn Tibbon translations of Maimonides' works, and therefore he went in that direction, and I think Aaron ben Joseph is really the real pioneer of Karaite thought. But unfortunately, he didn't write a philosophical treatise. His commentaries were not easily accessible. We have the Gozlova edition, which is now online. I also see it's on the list of books on sale by the Israeli Karaite community. Is that the Gozlova edition? And it's also in the real IDC collection and microfiche. So now it is available. That doesn't mean more people are reading it. But in addition to trying to show the interplay between Rabbinite and Karaite, or the Rabbinite influence on Charism, I tried to show the interplay between the Rabbinite and Karaite thought, such as the influence of Halevi and on the influence on Halevi and Maimonides, and Maimonides' influence on later Karaite thinkers. So I was trying to demonstrate that Karaite thought is not one-dimensional kalam as was once thought. In my book, not available over there, but available for seeing over there, I tried to tie it all together, studies in Byzantine Karaite thought. I expanded the chapter on Aaron ben Elijah to show that in general he tried to make a compromise between the old-style Karaite thought and the new-style Maimonideanism. I have other chapters on Karaite participation in the Jewish-Christian debate, Karaite attitudes towards Jerusalem, Charism in the afterlife. and the theory of compensation for animal suffering after death. So far, I can't say there's been very much reaction or any indication that others are looking at the same material. Maybe it's that I was so successful in my studies in Byzantine Karaite thought that people think there's nothing more to be done, nothing to criticize, or maybe at Brill's prices it's just not read. But I do think that there is more that can be done in the field of Karaite thought. And what I'd like to do now is talk about some of those things that still can be done, I think, would successfully or would be useful to do. In the Judeo-Arabic period, there are new editions becoming available, editions of Yefet and other exegetes, including Kirkasani's work. And I think it's time to go back and look at the Chaggai's dissertation and expand upon it. We have here with us my student Abi Bashir, who's working on 10th century attitudes toward angels in Judeo-Arabic thought, which would be Saji Gaon, but also Yefet Ben Eli and Yaqub al-Kirkasani. David Sclair pointed out that in Egypt, the move toward Aristotelianism was not the same as it was in Byzantium, and certainly there's a lot of material. I'm sure he'll be happy to tell you what he's found in Egyptian Karaite writers who have the philosophical material in their works. We need a full edition of Al-Basir's Muhtawi now that all the material is available from the former Soviet Union. In Byzantium, Hadassi is still a major project. There's no good text of his work. Haggai ben Shammai has been saying that for years. We'll see what can be done. Even though most of the Eshkol HaKofer is halacha, there's certainly additional theological material, there's polemics. There's so much in the Eshkol. And then there are the post-Basyachi figures in Byzantium, especially Caleb Afandopoulos, his brother-in-law, who wrote Asara Mamarot, which is very much influenced by Rabbinite thought, including Joseph Albo's Ikarim, his scientific works. Caleb Afandopoulos seems to be an excellent topic for a dissertation if you can get a student to be interested. In the same period, we're talking about 16th century Byzantium, Judah Gibor, who was a topic for a dissertation, Philip Miller's dissertation. There's also Moses Basyachi and the Beghi family. So there's still a great amount to be done in both the Judeo-Arabic period and the Byzantine period. An additional major task is the evaluation of the thought of Eastern European intellectuals. This is a field which has been almost untouched. Golda Achiezer will be with us on Thursday, has written a dissertation on the Karaite identity in Eastern Europe from 16th through 19th century, so she's dealt with many of these figures. Otherwise, many of them, their names are almost unknown or not totally unknown. So I'd like to discuss a little bit about their intellectual accomplishments before the specific issue of their theology or thought. And there are connections to theology even in what might be non-theological treatises. The first major Eastern European Karaite thinker was the Troki scholar Mordechai ben Sfania in the early 16th century. We don't know exactly when Karaites came to Eastern Europe, or which parts of Eastern Europe. It's a very important article by Golda Achiezer and Don Shapira in Pa'amim 89, if I'm not mistaken, about the traditions as to when Karaites arrived in Troki. But the first major figure was Mordechai ben Sfania. And it's interesting, we have at least two books, one on the calendar and one a guide to ritual slaughterers. And these are emblematic of Karaite concerns for this period. Why calendar? Because calendar is something that always interests the Karaites, and if there's anything that divides modern-day Karaites, some of the people with the websites I showed, is calendrical issues. Does one go back to observation? What about the Aviv and the new moon? In terms of ritual slaughter, Karaites could not depend upon Rabbinites to give them meat because they had different rules of ritual slaughter. They also had different rules of calendation. As I said, these are always questions of dispute. Calendar, because how to calculate it, by 16th century, they certainly did it by calculation and not observation. But even in terms of slaughtering of animals, the dispute was, what must the ritual slaughterer believe in order for his the animals he slaughters to be considered acceptable for use? And this goes back to the questions of compensation, the Tumurah, where some Karaites believe that the animals slaughtered for ritual purposes were rewarded by God in the afterlife. Other Karaites believe there is no reward for animals in the afterlife. So if you, depending on what you believe, you have to have your ritual slaughterer has to have the same beliefs. And there are other, throughout the period from the 16th to the 19th century, other works on ritual slaughter and other works on calendars. I can mention some of the names, I don't think I will. After Mordechai ben Sfania, the next important Karaite of Troki was Isaac ben Abraham of Troki, who's probably the Karaite author who is best well known among the general, not only the Jewish world, but even among non-Jews. He's known not for his Karaite work, but for his anti-Christian polemic, Chizuk Emunah. Isaac died in 1594 before the treatise was completed. And this is a treatise which was a bestseller. It was translated into a number of different languages. It raised the ire of a number of Christian Hebraists who responded to it. But very little, or I would say no Karaite content as such. In fact, it mentions Rabbinite sources, but doesn't mention any Karaite sources. One could argue that since Isaac does not respond to the Talmud, which was a major issue in the Jewish-Christian debate, then it's an indication of the Karaite content. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. Here's another example of a work which could use a very good edition. There are a number of relatively good editions, but no authoritative one. There's an English translation that's more a paraphrase than a translation. It was done in 1860 by Moses Makato in London. In his introduction, he already says that he left out arguments or language which would be inappropriate for his readers. Isaac was also interested in other Karaite pursuits. He wrote a refutation of rabbinism. Mordechai ben Sfania and Isaac both wrote liturgical poetry for Karaite use, and some of them were even in the Karaite language. And Isaac wrote some sermons. We're talking about the prayer book, and this is part of the development of the Karaite prayer book when they began to use religious poems, piyutim, which were composed for liturgical reasons. And also, this is the beginning of literary endeavors in the Karaite language that Henrik is an expert on. Isaac ben Abraham's students and successor was Joseph ben Mordechai Malinowski, who completed the Chizuk Emunah. His compositions include works on ritual slaughter, rules of forbidden sexual relations, which is another typical Karaite concern because the laws of incest were different. Work on dogmatics, a book of Karaite customs, liturgical poetry, a prayer book, and a super commentary on a small part of Aaron ben Joseph's commentary, Sefer Mivchar, and a small 1,000-verse poetic praise of God called Ha'elef L'cha, which even contains some Kabbalistic elements. I'll get back to Kabbalah later. This book, all of 11 pages long, was published by Manasseh ben Israel in Amsterdam in 1642-43, making the 5th Karaite book to be printed. Okay, I'm sure it's in the... Joseph's student was Zerach ben Natan of Troki, who lived 1578 to 1658, also relatively known among rabbinites because he was the Karaite whose correspondence with Joseph Solomon Del Medigo, it's Yashar of Candia, was the stimulus for a number of Del Medigo's books, unless that correspondence is actually Yashar's own invention. Zerach continued his teacher Yashar's interest in Kabbalah, and that was one of the subjects, his teacher, Joseph Malinowski, as one of the subjects of correspondence with Del Medigo. Another field of interest is biblical exegesis. We have all these people here do Karaite biblical exegesis and nothing from this period. The Bible is the ultimate source of Karaite praxis and authority. Because two good, understandable Hebrew commentaries existed, the Sefer Mivchar of Aaron ben Joseph the older and Ketchet Torah of Aaron ben Elijah the younger, apparently no one felt the need to write a new commentary, but there are many super commentaries to these commentaries, mostly on Sefer Mivchar, which tended to be less strict and more attuned with rabbinite ideas than Ketchet Torah. Super commentaries on all are part of Sefer Mivchar, written by Joseph ben Mordechai Malinowski, Samuel ben Joseph of Crimea, Aaron ben Judah Troki, Mordechai ben Nisan. Simcha ben Isaac Lutzki wrote a commentary in the 16th century. Byzantine Judah Gibor is mentioned. His poetic summary of the Pentateuch, Minchat Yehuda, entitled Be'er Yitzchak, which also serves as a Bible commentary. This is by those who don't know Minchat Yehuda. It's in the Karaite prayer book, and it is a poetic rendition of every parasha of the Torah used during the year. Again, these super commentaries have been mostly ignored. Eastern European Karaite intellectuals were also particularly active in historiography, specifically the origin and history of their sect. The proximate reason for this interest was often questions from Christian scholars, for many of whom the Western European discovery of charism in the 16th century was of particular interest. I mentioned earlier the interest of Protestants who were looking for the true Judaism before it was corrupted by the Talmud. So we have Solomon ben Aaron of Troki's Apirion Asalo was written in response to a request from the Swedish scholar Johann Uppendorf, 1696. And Solomon also wrote an anti-Christian polemic, Migdal Oz, edited by Golda Achiezer Ni, which is in the book there from Eastern European Karaites in the last generations. That book is available. Mordechai ben Nisan's Dode Mordechai was written in response to Jacob Triglin in 1699, as Levush Malchut was prompted by a question of Charles XII of Sweden in 1702. So we have a period there of a great interest in Christian Hebraism in Karaism, and great interest in Karaites in Christian Hebraism. Simcha Isaac Lutzki also engaged in the historiography of the sect in Mirat Einayim and Orach Tzadikim. These have all been discussed by Fred Astron in his Karaite Judaism and Historical Understanding. It seems, getting closer to the issues of thought, science, and philosophy, that despite the Karaite contacts with the outside world, they were relatively untouched by scientific developments in the early modern period. A good example is Simcha Isaac Lutzki, whom I mentioned a few times, who was adept in medieval philosophy. Now, Lutzki was aware of some of the aspects of modern science, but rejected them as speculative. Though more conservative than some earlier Karaite predecessors who tended toward Maimonideism, Lutzki, like other Karaite intellectuals, regarded Maimonides as a philosophical authority. Maimonides' anti-charism made no difference to him, since he adopted the Maimonidean principle to accept the truth no matter what the source of the truth. One of his compositions, one of the earlier ones, he wrote altogether about 24 books, was called Arba Yesodot, which is a combination of Aristotelian philosophy and some kalam, which he uses to prove creation of the world, God's existence, God's unity, and God's incorporeality. Notice that he follows the kalam pattern of doing creation first and then existence of God, but the basic worldview, such as the structure of the world, is Aristotelian. Traditionally, Karaites had denied the validity of Kabbalah, but Kabbalah also started making inroads in Eastern European Karaite thought, at least among the intellectuals. The peak of Karaite interest in Kabbalah comes to the work of the same Simcha Isaac Lutzki, who wrote 6 treatises devoted specifically to Kabbalah and included Kabbalistic material in some of his other books. A fuller account of this can be read in my article in the Bracha Zak Festschrift. In addition to the expositions of Kabbalistic doctrines, Lutzki defended the essential validity of Kabbalah, which he maintained was given by God on Mount Sinai to Moses was faithfully handed down to future generations. These traditions have been lost among the Rabbinites. The traditions have been lost among the Karaites, but they were preserved by the Rabbinites. Thus, it's interesting that Baalei Kabbalah, in the traditional Karaite meaning of Rabbinites, held mistaken beliefs. But Baalei Kabbalah, in the meaning of Kabbalists, preserved the true oral Torah, according to Lutzky. Lutzky's Kabbalah was mostly Lurianic, somewhat self-taught, somewhat eclectic, and also very artificial. What I mean by artificial is that there's no connection to Karaite halacha and praxis. One of the things about Rabbinite Kabbalah is this explanation of the observance of many mitzvot, especially in the rabbinic explanation. There's none of that in Lutzky's Kabbalah. There's no use of Karaite sources for Lutzky's Kabbalah as there is the way Kabbalah uses Rabbinite Midrashic sources. And there are reasons to believe that perhaps the lay Karaites were not as enamored by this esoteric learning as were the leaders, or at least as Lutzky was. So Kabbalah never catches on. All of Lutzky's compositions were copied many times with no indication of much impact on Eastern European Karaites. The past few years, Yosef Al-Gamil has been publishing Lutzky's work. I don't know if they've had any impact on the community. I myself am working on a book on Lutzky, which will include introduction for the shorter treatises, all published from autographs. It's interesting, that's one of the good things about Lutzky. We have autographs. In fact, we have multiple autographs, which these treatises, one on philosophy, one on exegesis, two of Kabbalah. And soon thereafter, Lutzky died in 1760. You can see also my article on Lutzky in the same Eastern European Karaites in the last generations, pictures of his tombstones, his tombstone, his wife's tombstone, thanks to Don Shapiro. There's very little Karaite creativity after that mid-18th century. Not totally, I'll mention in a minute. We've talked about contemporary Karaism and contemporary Karaite community. The issue is interesting, is there a contemporary Karaite thought? Well, as we know, most Karaites today are of Egyptian origin, and there's very little tradition of Egyptian Jewish creativity in general. Most of the creativity of that community was through immigrants. Think of Maimonides among the Rabbinites. Among the Karaites, Moses Derry the poet, Israel and Samuel Mechrabi, at least their families were from the West. The chief rabbis of the Egyptian Karaite community in the 19th and 20th centuries were imported either from Turkey or Eastern Europe. The last important one was Tuvia Bobovich. Bobovich is not exactly an Egyptian name. There's a very little original thought in Egyptian Karaism. And the community here, I'd say most of their writings, the original writings, are built mostly with halakhic issues, guides to practice which were necessary for the community. Rabbis Levi of blessed memory and Al-Gamil, Yibadel Chaim Arukim, have written some pieces with theological content, but mostly they're conservative expositions of Karaite theology. In other words, it's a very conservative view of attitudes toward God, providence, reward and punishment, and the like. In Eastern Europe, after Lutzky, there's not very much. There's some, for instance, Isaac ben Solomon wrote Pinat Yikrat, which is on the principles of the faith. It's a conservative reaction to Baciaci. And, of course, the last great Eastern European Karaite author was Abraham Firkovich. He wrote a number of different genres, including polemics, but I don't think that anyone would consider Firkovich a philosopher. So the period of Eastern European Karaite creativity is over, and perhaps that's a corollary of the Karaites separating themselves from Judaism and the Hebrew language. What I try to do now is an overview of what has been done and what remains. I've argued that Karaite thought is not as monochromatic as assumed, but also less exciting and original than it could have been. I think it should be seen as part of Jewish philosophy, part of the history of Jewish philosophy. It follows many of the same paths and deals with many of the same questions. I asked this morning, is there anything particularly Karaite about Karaite thought? We already found out there's nothing particularly Karaite about Karaite grammar. In terms of form, perhaps, especially Hebrew terms, interesting questions which were no longer being asked in Rabbinite thought, the reference in this work to previous Karaite sages. But overall, I think Karaite thought remains theological philosophy based on the joint Rabbinite Karaite Jewish tradition. Thank you. Willing to entertain questions, comments.
Where are these autographs from Lutzky preserved?
So we have some in JTS, and we have them in St. Petersburg. And the ones in JTS, it's interesting. They're written like within 6 months of each other. When Lutzky was still in Lutsk before he moved to Shufut Kale. And there are a lot of differences, but mostly in form and style. I mean, not content. It's very interesting. I'm trying to figure out why he changed just the way of writing it. I think what he was doing was writing them for purposes of selling them. In other words, they couldn't, the same reason we talked about the printing press, they didn't print their works. And he was a scribe, Paris 670, is that the one? The one that has the Ni'imot and Mahkimat Pedi was written by Lutzky. We also have a Hadassi manuscript written by Lutzky, which is now in Vienna, which has a very interesting, Ilana showed us one of the manuscripts which said it belonged to or whatever. Here, there's a written in that Lutzky had pawned this manuscript for whatever, because whatever reason people pawn things, and he was not able to redeem in his lifetime, and how his brother came after his death and redeemed the manuscript. There's also a letter we have from Lutzky to another community, I think to the Halitz community, trying to sell some of his manuscripts. So he obviously he couldn't make a big living teaching Karaite school children in Lutsk, which is one of the reasons he moved to Shufut Kale. He didn't like Shufut Kale at all. He saw himself as being in exile. But he had a sponsor in Shufut Kale, and Lutzky didn't have a sponsor. So he wrote all these manuscripts, and how they ended up in the Furkovich collection, presumably Furkovich brought them there. How they ended up in the outer collection, I don't know. But so we have JTS, and then the vast collection of Lutzky manuscripts, and also all the copies are in St. Petersburg.
When you're describing how in the Byzantine text you're seeing a gradual rapprochement with Rabbinite thought. I mean, did I understand that one of the drivers for this was simply practicality, in that there was a great accessibility to the day. There wasn't so much anything doctrinal, but the feeling there was some sort of desire to have a rapprochement on the rabbis. There was an issue of availability of text or comprehensibility of text. Was this quite a major driver, you think, or was there more to it than that? Was there sort of more of a desire to sort of have a rapprochement?
Aaron Ben Joseph says that he had difficulty reading Karaite texts. And he was the one who makes the translation from Kalam thought or pseudo-Kalam thought, such as Hadassi, to a much more Maimonidean position. The problem is that there are 150 years in between Hadassi and Aaron Ben Joseph. We don't know what was happening. We don't know the Zitz and Laban of that period. We have no literary remains from that period. Aaron Ben Elijah apparently had a living tradition of reading those Hebrew Kalam texts, and therefore he was able to incorporate more of them into his work. There is a Karaite tradition that he might have been from Egypt, but I don't know how true that is. Daniel Frank emphasizes how the educational background of how they apparently had classes on these texts he's from Nicomedia and then moved to Constantinople. Aaron Ben Joseph was originally from Crimea, Solchat in the Crimea. He describes a calendrical controversy there in 1294. So it's possible that in Byzantium itself, they were still reading some of this material, and in Crimea they weren't because of linguistic issues. But I think it's more than linguistic issues. Once they start reading Rabbinite sources, and they compare the arguments, let's say of Maimonides, to the arguments of the Kalam work, they came to the conclusion that Maimonides is much more scientific, much more up to date. Maimonides does have this katlani, this murderous criticism of the Kalam. In fact, after Maimonides, there's almost no Rabbinite Kalam whatsoever. By Maimonides' day itself, Kalam had become out of fashion. So I think there are a lot of things that combine. We also have to remember that Byzantium, especially by the 15th century when Basyachi was writing, had become a center for Sephardic immigration, and they brought with them the Sephardic philosophical traditions, and linguistic and exegetical, and therefore Abraham ibn Ezra, who though he was anti-Karaite, was still a Pashtan, a literalist sort of in his interpretation. And all this was probably very exciting to the Karaites, the small communities. They learning with the rabbinites. Mordechai Contino was taught Karaites, including Basyachi and Kalabef and Daf below. So it might, if the Karaite material were more readable, perhaps they would have stayed a little bit more loyal to those traditions. But when one adds the linguistic issues to the content, I think it was very difficult for them to maintain the old traditions. But again, we have four major representatives, Hadassi in the 12th century, Aaron Ben Joseph in the 13th, Aaron Ben Elijah in the 14th, and Basyachi in a circle in the 15th and early 16th century. It's not a whole lot of data to go on, but it's still, from my mind, and then looking at the later Eastern European material, there certainly was a tremendous change, and this accusation that Karaite thought never changed is obviously, to my mind, false.
Is there any evidence of Neoplatonist influences? Like, if they're reading Ibn Ezra for his Parshanut, there's a lot of Neoplatonism in his Parshanut.
I don't see any of that kind of content, and not the astrology, not the numerology, and not... they liked Ibn Ezra, despite his anti-Karaite sections, because he was not Rashi and wasn't... and Basyachi actually says that if it were not for their fear of the mobs, of the masses, both Ibn Ezra and Maimonides would not have said things against Karaites. In fact, they would have been Karaites. They would have accepted Karaism, but they were afraid of the unwashed masses.
Perhaps to ask, how do you assess the contribution of Samuel Pigit and David Kukizov? Did they contribute to development of, I don't know, the words written in Hebrew, but so they are said to, because perhaps you finished your outline of this Eastern European Karaite with Simcha Lutsky.
Yes, there are some. It's true there are some, and Mordechai Sultansky. It was not as perhaps I drew the picture too starkly, but the interests there are historiographical, polemical. I mean, Sultansky's historiography, and then Firkovich, very little, from what I've seen, very little thought content other than Pinachi Prat, which is about the 10 principles of Judaism. It is interesting. Dogmatics is of interest to Karaites, but not necessarily for the purposes of distinction between Karaism and Rabbinism, but for just pedagogical reasons for their communities.
What about William Goldstein mentioned before the criteria of genres? You have mentioned all books that one can look at Karaiteology. Maybe it will be a good idea to look at it through genres, when and why in the beginning of the Judeo-Arabic area you have books devoted only to theology. And then you mentioned Etz Chaim or Aderet Eliyahu. Etz Chaim is devoted only to theology, and Aderet Eliyahu is another kind of book. And of course, the book of Yehuda Hadassi. So, one of the questions that when I'm looking at the Karaite work and literature, when and why they devote special books for theology, and it shows a lot of the kind of society they are living, and in every book, what is the importance of theology in the environment of the book.
Thank you. It's food for thought. There's certainly fewer works devoted only to issues of thought, theology, or philosophy, or science among Karaites than there were proportionally among Rabbinites, I think. And Karaites included non-halachic material in their halachic works and non-exegetical materials in their exegetical works, etc. Whether we can do it because of the context, I'm not sure, because Caleb Afendafalo has somewhat the same context as Elijah Basyachi, but Afendafalo writes Asara Mamarot, which is then has never been published, and I'm sorry, Amar Gamil published it, but it's never really been studied well. Plus all his scientific works, which have been almost undealt with. Different genre than his brother-in-law Elijah Basyachi, same period, same time. Afendapolo completes Basyachi's Aderet Eliyahu. I would not be surprised that, given the limited resources and numbers in the Karaite community, that once they had the book Eitz Chaim, and they had Aderet Eliyahu, and they had Sefer Mivchar, and in addition to the other works by Aaron ben Elijah, Ketchet Torah and Gan Eden, that such a monumental work was somehow no longer felt necessary. These were the authoritative works. If you want to know how we should read the Torah, we have Ketchet Torah and Sefer Mivchar. If you want to know what the law is, we have Gan Eden and Aderet Eliyahu. If you want to know what the philosophy is, you read Eitz Chaim. After all, Basyachi, even though I think he disagreed a lot with Eitz Chaim, recommends that Eitz Chaim is the authoritative work. What is of interest is Lutzky, who writes so much in so many different genres, but usually very short, relatively short works. As the Arba Yesodot, the 6 Kabbalistic works, some exegetical works, calendars, ritual slaughter, polemics, and some of these works are quite long. If you look at Siach Yitzchak on Yehuda Gibor, Be'er Yitzchak is on the Yehuda Gibor, Siach Yitzchak. It's another super commentary. These are major, major long works. I mean, this man in 44 years of life wrote more than most of the people in this room are like in 120. And I don't know what it was about Lutsk which made him sit down and write books that no one was reading and he couldn't sell.
Maybe he had all the sources.
He had sources, but
the other hadn't before. Maybe this was an influence.
Maybe.
Well, check.
It is interesting that manuscripts were copied so much. This is I mentioned earlier today about how Karaites continued copying manuscripts until the 20th century. That we have another work which presumably is by Simcha Yitzchak Lutzky, even though he never mentions in his later work, that Golda Achiezer and I published, Elon Moreh, is a sort of like a catechism, and if it's he and if the dating is correct, he wrote it when he was 13 years old. I think it was a homework assignment, but he obviously was a precocious young man. why he wrote so much and what he was hoping to do with it. I think it was part of an educational project for his community, but I'm not sure his community was ready for it. Okay, we like to leave it. Asher,